Dostoevsky obviously thought a great deal about the form of this piece, but nevertheless, he wanted to give the impression of immediacy, the impression of talking to you directly from his heart, directly from his soul. And of course, presumably the person who wrote these, a fictional character named the Underground Man, Человек из подполья, the man from the underground. Dostoevsky makes, in the beginning, you understand that it's an essay on behalf of freedom. And it's an essay exploring the nature of freedom, particularly in relation to the possibility of love. How can we have freedom and love at the same time when love, after all, implies dependence on somebody else's will? And Dostoevsky himself, in the course of presenting this protagonist, contradicts him in the introduction when he says that such people that you'll read in this piece not only can, but must, get the must, exist in our society, taking into account the circumstances under which our society has developed. Now, Dostoevsky is trying to argue for the autonomy of the human spirit. The Underground Man is arguing that he will depend on no one, no matter what this leads to in his own life. And here Dostoevsky is cutting him out at the very beginning by saying he was a product of circumstances of society at his time, and because of these circumstances, he must exist. This is typical for Dostoevsky, who always deals in paradox and in dialectic. He never makes a forward statement without also making the exact opposite backward statement and leaving you somewhere in between, mulling it over in your mind, and of course going deeper in the process of what's going on. Now, the novel begins with the most unlikely phrases. If you ever tried this with a writer of creative writing, I can imagine what they would say. It begins like this. Я человек больной. I'm translating literally now. I, man, sick. Я злой человек. I, evil man. Непривлекательный я человек. Unattractive or repulsive I, man. Now, what kind of a character would say this about himself? And would present himself at the beginning, and then of course he immediately afterwards says, "I think my liver is hurt." And then, of course, he immediately denies that it's not because of his liver, it's because of the kind of a person he is. The Underground Man is constantly proceeding about and talking about things which make him turn out to be a most impossible and repulsive sort of a person. And this goes on in the most febrile way possible. The Underground Man takes us through his refutation of the whole 19th century notion of progress, human improvement, the possibility of a decent human society. His refutation is based on the demonstration that all such possibilities are based on the necessity for controlling human actions and desires, which all intelligent people fiercely resist when they want to give you this kind of control. It's interesting that, of course, this is supposed to be the confession of a man who's talking directly to the reader, and yet somehow or other there suddenly appears an interlocutor in the text. And of course the interlocutor starts to argue with the Underground Man. He says, "Now wait a minute, how can you possibly argue that a decent human society is not possible? Surely you understand that if everybody had a real understanding of true self-interest, we would act in such a way so as not to hurt other people, so as to cooperate with other people to make an ideal human society, because of course we want other people to act toward ourselves in the same way." This of course is echoes of John Stuart Mill and the utilitarianism and later socialism of the 19th century. The idea that when people are truly educated in a decent way, they will be decent people. That there's no evil inside of human beings. They don't learn, and they can learn to be good. The symbol of this in the 19th century was the Crystal Palace in London, where everything was clean and pure, just like crystal. And the interlocutor says, "Now look, you certainly wouldn't act against your own self-interest, would you?" And the Underground Man says, "Oh, you naive person, you most naive of all people. Of course I would act against my own interest. You think that what's to my own interest? I would act against it only to prove that I'm a free person. I'm not to be controlled by anyone's self-interest, least of all my own. I will do exactly what I want, even if I know that ahead of time that action will hurt me. Because by doing that, I prove that I'm a free person and not a piano key in the hands of God." The interlocutor says, "The next thing you know, you'll be saying that a toothache is a good thing." He says, "Yes, indeed. A well-placed toothache is a very good thing. As a matter of fact, when a person has a toothache, he groans in a most musical way. And the neighbor has to listen to it in terrible pain, and he knows he's inflicting pain on his neighbor, and boy, does he enjoy it. Not a very easy man to deal with. Then he says, well, what about paradise? Don't you want to go to paradise someday? The underground man says, and of course there's a very famous phrase from Dostoevsky, he says, if I were in paradise, I would throw myself out the window rather than have to admit that 2 times 2 equals 4. He says, I know that mathematics tells us that 2 times 2 equals 4, but you know, 2 times 2 equals 5 is also a nice thing. Here, the underground man is throwing himself out of paradise only to prove that he is a free individual. No matter what he's done in his life, he's always made himself obnoxious. He's always gone outside human society. He's always insulted his friends. He's always tried to prove to his friends in school that he was the most intelligent, that he was the most knowledgeable, that he was what he was. And of course the result is nobody wants to have anything to do with him. He lives in total isolation in this underground, this cellar of his. There's pain here. There's deep pain here. But at the same time, there's also an argument for freedom, and of course, there's an argument that looks inside of ourselves to that perverse, nasty little devil that lives inside of every one of us, that somehow we would do something for spite, we would do something for perversity, we would do something to show that we are not controlled by anything outside of ourselves. But at that moment, his attention is suddenly diverted to snow falling outside his window. This wet snow is made yellow by the light of lanterns, which, under other circumstances, might bring a little bit of softness to the scene. But in the mind of the narrator, it only brings back memories, in some ways horrifying memories, which you'll call a story concerning wet snow. Now, you understand the color yellow is often connected with very strong human perception. There was a time when it was considered that the yellow spot in the eye was the most sensitive part of the eye to light and to what we understand from the outside world. And of course, the yellowness of this light, which is going to be reflected, of course, in the next part of the story, makes that snow something that goes very penetrating and very much inside the feelings of the underground man. Now, the first part has been a confession, a simple pouring forth of the feelings and the ideas from inside one particular person. The second part turns to something that happened actually much earlier than the first part. It's kind of a flashback in a way. And in the second part, we see some reminiscences of the underground man, which gives you some idea of why he became what he did in the first part. It starts with an epigraph taken from a popular poem by Nekrasov. You remember the editor who had first accepted Dostoevsky's manuscript. And in the poem, Nekrasov, who prided himself on improving the life of fallen women, of course, Dostoevsky's used the very notion of fallen women implies that men somehow have a right to judge someone else, which he doesn't believe. He thinks there's a kind of a self-satisfaction in this poem which is deeply repulsive to him. And Nekrasov brags about how he's brought several fallen women into his house, and they end up as respectable women. He takes them off the street. He tries to improve their lives, and so on and so on. Clearly, Dostoevsky thinks that those who are proud of doing something like that are only trying to set themselves up and don't really have love toward the people they claim to have affection for. Now, the memories start out with a great deal of self-contempt. There's a very famous scene where the underground man goes to a tavern. He's very, very lonely because nobody wants to have anything to do with him. He goes to a tavern to try to establish relations with people, and of course he acts in such a way that eventually they throw him out the window. And he sees a particular officer there whom he wants to confront. And so he decides that walking down the main street of Petersburg, Nevsky Prospect, he will confront this man and let the man see what an underground man really is like. And of course, the officer pays no attention to him whatsoever. He tries it the second and the third time as if the underground man doesn't exist. So he goes to great lengths to get himself dolled out in a new coat, a new fake beaver collar, a respectable look, because you can't bump into a man, without a respectable coat. And then at a certain time, he plans this for months and months, at a certain time he goes down the street and deliberately bumps shoulder to shoulder with this officer. Of course, the officer pays him absolutely no attention and goes on. He says, I know he noticed me, I know. He says, many, many years later, I thought about this man who by that time was gone. He said, I asked myself, Где он теперь, голубчик? Where is he now, the little pigeon dove? Кого он давит? Whom is he bumping into now? Who is he crowding out of the way? The idea of this officer to whom he wanted to bump into, well-dressed, and of course the fact of being well-dressed was very important here. Being well-dressed was the most important thing that he remembered, the most important thing that he held in his own memory. And curiously, this man who he wanted to bump into to show who he was turns into a little pigeon dove, something that he was very fond of. In short, he hugs all of these things to his bosom in a very perverse and, in no small way, obnoxious way. Well, eventually he gets in contact with some former schoolmates of his, and he invites himself to a sort of a cocktail party they're having for their friends. And in that cocktail party, of course, they put him down. He tries to show off his intelligence. They put him down enormously. Everything he says, they react to in ways that he feels totally dehumanized. Finally, he drinks a great deal of champagne, and for 2 hours, while they talk to each other and ignore him, he walks back and forth, for 2 whole hours. At a so-called dinner and cocktail party, where there they are drinking and talking among themselves. It's a most embarrassing and terrible moment, and a moment, of course, that anybody can understand if you've ever been to a cocktail party where you don't know anybody and you have a hard time making contact. At the end of it, they all decide to go off to a house of ill repute. He doesn't have any money, but he wants to follow, and he badgers he has the nerve to badger one of them still to lend him some money after what the tricks that he's pulled at that party. The guy gives him money to get rid of him. He goes to the house of ill repute. By that time, of course, they've all disappeared. And then he meets a very strong woman, Lisa, a prostitute. A little bit reminiscent of Varvara from the former story. Again, a very strong woman. He begins by trying to take advantage of her, as a customer of a prostitute might, but this isn't satisfactory to him. Obviously, there's no real contact in that kind of a physical connection. And so he decides he'll show her who's who and what's what, and he begins to preach her a sermon telling her what her terrible end is going to be. He even imagines her in the cemetery when she's been tossed out after she's been used as a prostitute. He manages to get to her. For the first time in the story, he's actually made contact with a human being, and what he's doing is being terribly mean to a woman who, after all, at least has shown him some consideration. He gets her miserably sobbing and tells her, look, you have to get out of a life like this. Somehow or other, he gives her his address. She takes it. He goes home and thinks, oh, my God, what have I done? And lo and behold, after a particularly unpleasant scene with his own servant, whom of course, he hasn't been paying, and the servant tells him who's who and what's what, all of a sudden, she's at the door. And he begs the servant, look, get out of here, do something to put me in a decent condition. She comes in, and of course, she's terribly shocked by the poverty of his dwelling. She had thought from the way he talked to her that he was well off. And he begins to pour out his grief before her for the first time. The underground man is actually, in a certain sense, trying to make human contact with another human being. And of course, it's a woman, and a very strong woman at that, in spite of the fact that she's been forced into prostitution. And he says, they won't let me be decent, they won't let me. She understands. She comes to him, she embraces him, and they, again, make physical contact on the couch. And he suddenly realizes what he's doing. And when they're finished, he suddenly shoves a 5-ruble note into her hand. And of course, she's very angry and very hurt. She goes out the door, slamming the glass door. And his last chance for genuine contact with another human being has been lost. That glass door closing is putting him in hell, which, as Dostoevsky says repeatedly, hell is the place where a person lives who's unable to love. The underground man has consigned himself to hell, to the impossibility of love, in order to experience the freedom he wants. And of course, for him, love and freedom together are impossible. Now, in the future works of Dostoevsky, we're going to explore how Dostoevsky tries to deal with this problem. This is the most gloomy part of his writing.